Hello and a warm virtual welcome from me, Michael Jacobides, professor at the London Business School, videotaping that from Greece. And I'm going to be joined by Alan Inney, who's joining us from New York. Alan is a partner and director of the scenarios and creativity part of the Boston Consulting Group, where I'm also an academic advisor. And we're going to be speaking about navigating the uncertainties and being able to be effective in the new reality. So, not to waste any time on that, Alan, as we've got a very packed agenda here. Tell me a little bit, how do you think that it's best to be able to plan when we don't know the next thing about when the economy will open up, how long this recession is going to be, how deep the problems are, what structures and policies will emerge from that? What's your take on the best way of dealing with it and planning for something that is so fundamentally uncertain and unclear?
I think you're asking the right questions. And my clients, you're right, they're bombarded with short-term views about epidemiology and economics and demand recovery and when can we reopen. And what I try and work towards is thinking about these new realities, indeed the medium term. What might things look like? Because beyond the idea of more virtual work, perhaps, or some other things like that we can roughly agree on, there are still huge amounts of uncertainty around climate change, technology, role of government, and so on and so forth. And so the key, I think, is to embark on the kind of traditional scenario planning one might do for the long term, but think about it for just the medium term, 2, 3, 4 years hence. Lay out different pictures of what these new realities might look like, and think about what it would take to be as prepared as possible for as many of them as possible, because that can lead directly to short-term decisions around capital allocation and more. So this to me is sort of preparing now for the things that we have to humbly acknowledge we cannot predict. And I know that much of your work also relies on really thinking now about business model innovation and how we can adapt, yes, to this new reality.
Indeed, I think that one of the big problems that we have is that, and I'd love to hear your views on that, is that we can think about the long term, but the problem is that this challenge is also affecting our viability. So we have two problems with this crisis. On the one hand, you have the problem of immediate survival. And immediate survival means clearly that you need to be focusing on things like cash. You need to be able to find ways of battening these hatches, of shoring up the credit lines, of making sure that you are able to go through the next 3, 6, 12 months, and also to start thinking about how you will be investing in the things that make sense. Because, of course, the biggest mistake that you can make, and unfortunately this is something that we see crisis after crisis, is that you are only thinking about the immediate cost-cutting, cash preservation, without thinking that at the same time you need to find the next growth levers, and you need to say, what is it that I should put my money in? And just to give you one example of that, I think that Ken Chenault, the CEO of American Express, had it right during the global financial crisis when he said that we are ruthlessly cost cutting, but we need to see what are the areas that we need to be investing in so that we can come out stronger. And they have grown tenfold since that time. And I think that it is critical to be able to not only say that the world is different, but start thinking about how I can rethink what the structure is and what these opportunities are, how I can reimagine my business model, and how I can reallocate capital, which is something that companies really are loath to do. So let me turn back to you and ask you about how you help people, because part of your objective, part of your role is to get methodologies that allow people to figure out what the future will look like and what's going to go up, what's going to go down, what areas that you were involved in worked and perhaps would not. When you think about these scenarios, are you thinking about things that are totally far out, or can you do scenario planning that relates to things that are really up in the air but are closer to you in terms of time? Is it a question of the nature of uncertainty? Is it a question of the nature of time? And when you get in that exercise, what does it feel like for the uninitiated?
It's a great question. I think even a few months ago, we would be thinking about scenarios for 2050 and 2030, and it's a beautiful exercise in creativity and stretching the thinking. But the same principles apply now if we think about, let's call it the medium term, and we can quibble at some point, or other epidemiologists and economists can argue about whether it's 21, 22, or 23. But once we are past the short term crisis, once we've sort of stabilized things in some way, what might things look like? And it's absolutely possible to lay out a picture of a world that is massively anti-globalized, very protectionist, every region or country in it for herself, and really thinking about how we can procure what we need and focus on ourselves. Or imagine a world where the virus persists and there's a second wave and third wave, and governments incent technology startups and all sorts of digital transformations to happen. And many of these things that we're dealing now become the new normal in some sense from a tech perspective. Or imagine a completely different world where we get so close to the brink of disaster that we finally do realize we're all in it together, and we begin to tackle things from a global perspective, not just with regard to a vaccine, say, but regarding climate change and other issues. I think the point is to allow an organization's leaders to really immerse themselves in these pictures and say, what would it take for me to win in that world? What would it take for me to win in this one? And what would I have to start doing differently now to prepare? And if one can then arrive at a set of potential no regret moves or contingent moves, it can be a very, very powerful exercise.
Terrific. Let me just ask you a follow-up question on that, because essentially what you're saying, if I get it right, is that you are helping through the scenario exercise people sort of unblock their own imagination and understand that the world can look fundamentally different. And it can look fundamentally different in some predictable ways. And you're helping say, well, let's try to figure out what these predictable ways. And you would usually come, at least in my experience, in four. Perhaps sometimes it's more, the number magic number way increase. I'd be curious to see how many scenarios you look at. But imagine then you find them. Is the objective to assess probabilities, then say 20% I believe that this is the kind of world and 30% that it is this kind of world? Or is the benefit saying, oh, I am now creating a what if analysis that can help me figure out a game plan that is attached to each of these potential future worlds?
Well, look, first of all, I do like four. You're right. There's an infinite number of possible future scenarios. But in the end, the idea is to find a small set that's reasonably representative and covers what we think are the core uncertainties that are affecting the business world and the public sector today. And so let's suppose it's four for the sake of argument. Then if you come up with what would we do under each of them, having four distinct strategies is not super helpful on its own. And so this is where the question of, are there some no regret moves I should make? Are there some things I should plan for? But then, can we actually nudge the world in a direction that we think is better for us? Can we actually help shape the future in that way? It's not just a question of waiting to see what happens and being complete takers on the situation, but rather, can we additionally find ways to nudge the world in a certain way through our investments and our partnerships or our lobbying or whatever the case may be? To help push the world in that direction. One way I would frame it is that, and you'll understand this well from your work, in every future scenario, okay, sure, there will be some sectors that will have an easier time and a harder time, but within each sector, there will be winners and losers. And this kind of stretching of the thinking really is about improving the odds. A lot of the trends and uncertainties that we're seeing now emerging, virtual work, telemedicine, virtual reality, all of this stuff, it's not newly invented as a result of this crisis. It's simply dramatically accelerated. And that's what's really squeezing the timeline for all of this kind of thinking. And so all the more reason, as you are getting at, why this kind of innovative thinking and arriving at possibilities for business model innovation becomes ever more critical during a crisis time like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, and
how
it's
are you
interesting that
thinking
you say
about
that.
the business model innovation framework? Go ahead.
So, a couple of things to say. The first thing is that I guess that one of the challenges that we've got to face is that we've got to figure out what are the early indications that we have, even if we don't want to think about the medium and long term perspectives. There are some questions of what will rebound and what will not, because there's two issues. One, which way will the world change? I need to know whether this is something that's going to be viable, because if I'm going to make long term investments, if I'm going to be staking my reputation, if I'm going to start putting capital, I want to have some confidence that I'm doing it, having it thought that through. And I think that this is where the work that you're discussing in terms of the scenarios comes in, to say, have I done my future proofing? Have I thought things through? Have I taken all of these things that may be a little too complicated to contemplate, and when I put them all together in a coherent world? This is what I think the value of the scenarios that you're discussing is. Now, in addition to that, I think that you need to think about a few things that are more immediate, and the immediate is is changing, and it is now changing because we've got a very interesting disruption. So think about what we've got ahead of us. What we're looking at is not just a crisis which also led to a recession, like we had in the global financial crisis, where first the banks could not operate safely, and then we had both a financial crisis and then a macroeconomic crisis. Well, unfortunately, we are going to have a macroeconomic crisis, so much we do know. But we also have something that is changing the way that people work and people communicate and people consume. And what's really interesting, which makes all of this think carefully about the future work much more relevant now, is that we know that there are significant patterns that are being disrupted. The way that you buy stuff now, relates to this device, your mobile phone, because your mobile phone is your gateway to the world in more powerful ways than it would have been in the past. Soon enough, we're going to use it to track our health or other people's health and geolocation. This is the way that you connect to work. We have started changing the way that we engage with retail. And what we know as we study habits is that habits take anywhere from 20 to 84 days to change. Actually, if I want to turn something into a habit, if it's a glass of water, in 21 days I'm done. If it's push-ups, even 84 days might not cut it. So, a little harder there. But it is something that it allows us to think about how we're changing our behavior, because we have seen this massive discontinuity. So we know that people are changing how they're shopping. And the question is, will they return to the same world? I mean, just a couple of hours ago, I finished the faculty board that I had with my colleagues at London Business School. We're asking ourselves this question: what will people want in terms of business education? What are the needs? In which way can we think about the changes that we have? Because some of these changes are just going to be temporary and boosts. If you sell, hand sanitizer or masks, or if you sell material for ICU, that's going to be a one-off. Things will return, perhaps slightly differentiated, but they will return. At the same time, this is catalyzing things that otherwise would not happen. So, working with Philips, CIO, CSO, we're now looking at what are these changes that we're seeing in medical technology, where you can say that COVID-19 will change the willingness and openness of people to share information between different players. And if that changes, what will that do to the business model of organizations in the healthcare sector? That could be really major. It could be major in the way that the hospitals are making money. It could be major in the way that the doctors engage with diagnostics, with pharmaceutical companies that are now rethinking how they need to engage in these digital ecosystems and how they need to embed themselves. So I think that what is important now, in addition to thinking about the long-term dynamics that you just mentioned, Alan, is to think about how the information that we have tells us what is a temporary change and what is a structural change that may have been brought forward. And we've seen that. Greece has actually, if anything, benefited from it, paradoxically, because there was a long held resistant to change. And one of the big governments, in my sense, of a big success, of this government, is to be able to push digital transformation and make sure that this happens, because now there is a willingness to change. So we're in this interesting period where we have the potential of undoing some of the built-in resistance to change and think about how we're going to figure out which of these things that we're seeing in the external environment will essentially lead us to a new world, and if we can, adjust as early as we can. Now, that brings me to another question that I had, because this brings me to the issues that we face because of what organizations left to their own devices will do. And the basic answer is they will do tomorrow what they did yesterday, because that is organizational nature, even more so than human nature. And part of what we do, I guess, as both thought leaders or advisors, is try to nudge and help organizations figure out that that's not working for them. Now, one of the ways that you work is try to say, well, let me help you with scenarios that will be able to push our thinking. Now, when you do that, you probably see some challenges in implementing them and some difficulties in either making them effective or, even after you're done with this exercise, making them have an impact. Which are they?
Yeah, I'm so glad you pivoted to the organizational elements, because you're right. Human nature is okay, we'll get used to virtual shopping, we'll get used to delivery, and maybe even telemedicine for those of us who need it and all the rest. But when we think about the organizational angles of this, too often people tend to say, well, look, you look at the last financial crisis, and we had Uber and Airbnb, and it's going to be the startups who push us in a new direction, and so on and so forth. One of the things that I'm trying to advocate for is that the large corporations, the Fortune 500 equivalents around the world, do not have to simply wait to be disrupted. This kind of business model innovation is the sort of thing that can be done now if we are willing to challenge some of our assumptions, if we are willing to even identify some of these implicit assumptions of this is the way we've always done it, or this is how we think about the customer demand, or this is how we think about the competition. And we find ourselves actually willing to tackle some of those things. What it means, we are seeing more and more organizations transcending industry boundaries and moving into new spaces. We are seeing more and more organizations try and get directly to the end consumer where they might not have before. You have PepsiCo now in the United States experimenting with means of selling products directly to consumers rather than simply through third-party retail, which is a massive change to the environment that's being fiddled with now, but it fits very neatly with the kind of COVID environment we're in now. So all of these elements of business model innovation and exploring some of the different possibilities are things that we have to encourage our clients to work on now. It's not simply enough to say that in the last recession there was a 4% bump for those who were willing to actually invest in this. It's a question of finding the right assumptions to challenge now and make the case that business model innovation is as urgent as ever.
Terrific. And I think that that brings us to what is usually the toughest challenge when it comes to organizations, which is their own habits. Earlier on, you were saying, how do I think about the changes in terms of business models? And of course, you have to figure out which way, how things are changing and what are the trends and which things are going to be temporary. You have to think about how do they come in a business model. But most importantly, you have to have the courage to be able to reallocate your cash, which is hard, and your energy, and reprioritize. And what we have seen as we have looked at a number of different crises in the past is that this is what is the hardest thing to do. Now, as we look and ask executives and we say, do you see big changes? The answer is yes. But unfortunately, most of them are focusing on a few things that are easy, like working from home and sometimes getting new digital channels. They don't yet do as much of the hard work of rethinking their business models, or even more importantly, reallocating capital. So I guess that what we have learned in the previous crisis and what we'll see in this crisis is that those that have the courage to do that, those that are able to put their money where their mouth is, those that are able to stretch their imagination, going to what you were saying, will be able to turn from that victorious. And I hope that with this and with all the interesting stuff that you've shared us, we have helped provide some new perspectives that could be useful as we try to successfully navigate uncertainty in the new realities that lie ahead. So for me, Michael Jacobides, thank you very much. And from Alan as well in New York.
Courage. Thank you, Michael.
That was
Whew,
great.
terrific.
I hope it fit the bill. I certainly enjoyed it. We could go on for hours on that one.
Oh, yeah.